The Ring of Fire: Resource Development on Indigenous Lands by Maria Benak. This presentation will discuss a large mining site that is set to be developed in the James Bay region of Northern Ontario on First Nations land. The CEO of the mining company involved, Alan Clouds, has assured the public and First Nations communities that a new road network will be created that will provide neighboring communities with access to provincial highways. There is division between First Nations communities surrounding the area of development. Some are confident that the positive effects of this development will bring more benefit to the community and are not dwelling on the possible negative effects. Others are more concerned with the detrimental effects that resource development has on the land and communities. European contact in Canada had a significant impact on Indigenous peoples as they suffered a loss of land and resources. The Minister of Natural Resources in 1996, Chris Hodgkin, said that it is because Ontario had such a rich history of mineral development that it established the province as Canada's leading mining region. He further states that the country has benefited from this proficiency in the mining industry and gives importance to the many reserves that remain undeveloped. This gives a good conception of how Canada has and is currently insistent upon developing what is untapped and valuable in order to yield profit. Indigenous communities have different and oftentimes contrasting meanings of land in comparison with non-Indigenous Canadians. This difference in values creates additional conflict when dealing with land, as there are people's individual values and alternate views of the importance of land. The developers in this case are motivated by their desire for power, and land is of great material use in this endeavor. From the perspective of many Indigenous communities, land is more than a physical resource. It has intrinsic value. Chief Harold Turner from a Cree Nation in Manitoba said, "Our responsibilities to Mother Earth are the foundation of our spirituality, culture, and traditions. This speaks to the embedded importance of the earth and all it has to offer to many Indigenous communities." Chief Cornelius Wabase from Wabeki First Nation is confident that the road will bring various benefits to their community, as well as provide them better access to surrounding areas, goods, and services. It is important to recognize that different perspectives exist among Indigenous communities, and there are no blanket opinions that all possess. In the video on the slide, Ontario's Premier Kathleen Wynne is sharing her hope for the potential of the Ring of Fire and the opportunities for industry which will stem from it. She speaks of how important it is to bring everyone to the table, despite the fact that some First Nations communities do not see this rhetoric in the actions of the government and the companies involved. Premier Kathleen Wynne announced on August 21st that she had reached an agreement with 3 Northwestern Ontario First Nations to build a road into the Ring of Fire. 2 communities in this region say that her statement does not reflect their individual consultation with Premier Wynne. One of these communities is Neskantaga First Nation, who has specific trouble dealing with the drilling company Naront. This First Nations community has a development protocol that is present to help with methods of engagement and negotiation. Neskantaga says that the company has not consulted with this document, and therefore they are not permitted to drill on their land. Along with the lack of communication, leadership from Neskantaga as well as another community nearby are concerned with what environmental impacts industrialization will have on their water systems. Participation by First Nations groups should not be limited to impact assessments for projects, but they should also take place in the strategic planning phase. Some Indigenous people or thinkers possess something called traditional ecological knowledge, which is defined as a body of knowledge built up by a group of people through generations of living in close contact with nature. This set of knowledges can be difficult to use in conjunction with Eurocentric knowledge, as they are incompatible sets of values. Where Indigenous models are more concerned with the process, Eurocentric models are more focused on the product. This can lead to combating values and a power imbalance between the more dominant model of knowing against a more traditional one. Finally, here is a lack of trust that exists between First Nations communities and government or development actors from years of mistreatment as a part of an agenda of assimilation. This is a major obstacle to co-management. Indigenous communities do not want to be considered just as another stakeholder in the proceedings. They should be involved from the initial stages of the decision-making process. The rights of Aboriginal peoples, ignored by colonial policy, began to be recognized in the 1970s. These rights achieved constitutional recognition with their inclusion in the Constitution Act of 1982. Chief Liz Atlukan from Neskantaga First Nations was disheartened by the building of roads on their territory while not obtaining community approval. She also highlights the disregard of treaty rights and inherent rights that they as a community are witnessing. John Burroughs says that the treaty relationship is an accumulative relationship. Therefore, it has and continues to develop over years of agreements and negotiations. In the case of the Ring of Fire, Neskantaga is an example of a community who feels this accumulative relationship has come to a halt. Ontario.ca describes what a true partnership between Indigenous people and Canada would look like when dealing with natural resources. This includes both parties being included in managing the land and resources. It outlines the fair distribution of the economic benefits of said development. This can be seen as problematic because, yes, they will be sharing the economic benefit, but some local communities feel they will be plagued with the negative environmental effects. Additionally, there is a mining and minerals section where there are more technical guidelines on education and recognition of Aboriginal treaty rights, legislation, and regulation. The Crown has been known to use their power by way of written documents to dictate where Indigenous peoples live and how their land should be utilized to warrant the greatest profit. However, in certain contexts of dealing with Aboriginal people, the Crown has a duty to consult actions and/or decisions that could affect an Aboriginal person's or treaty rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. This could take the form of environmental assessments and approvals regarding a certain development project. The graphic below is useful to understand the process by which the Crown follows to determine whether there is a duty to consult. Section 91 of the Constitution states that the Crown has jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians, as well as other pieces of legislation such as the First Nations Land Management Act infringe on First Nations land sovereignty. When looking at this issue through the lens of various First Nations communities, it is obvious that some have stronger feelings than others regarding the effects that development will have on their land and people. Since there is such a variation of opinions, proper agreements can and should only be made when First Nations communities are involved in all stages of the decision-making process. Thank you for listening.